Let's go on and get started tonight. We're going to continue and conclude our study of the book of Nehemiah tonight. And Lord willing, next Wednesday we'll begin our study of the book of Esther, which is also framed in this time period. Before we get started, I want to say a word of thanks again for Boyd for filling in for me last Wednesday on short notice. I think Boyd's taught more of this class than I have, but I'm just grateful for his willingness to step up and lead us and lead those who are here in the study. Tonight we're going to be looking at three chapters, chapter 11, 12, and 13, which really conclude our study of the book of Nehemiah. But before we get into the text itself, I want to take just a few moments and look at something that is not necessarily unique, but seems very peculiar to Nehemiah. Nehemiah seems to be a guy who likes lists. I mean, you look at 13 chapters in the book of Nehemiah and look at how many of the verses are taking up and making lists for the people. It may be because Nehemiah was governor or he was a cupbearer. Maybe he had a bureaucratic type of tendency. But we see lists all over the book of Nehemiah. We see them in chapter 3 where he lists all the workers on the wall. We see it in chapter 7 where he lists all those who returned with Zerubbabel. We look in chapter 8, he makes a list of all those who were present when Ezra read the law. We look at chapter 10, they list all the 84 men who set their seal to the covenant. And finally here in chapters 11 and 12, he's going to list all those who go to dwell in Jerusalem. Nehemiah, as much as it is history, also is a book of lists. And we have to take into account, besides Nehemiah's own tendencies, Nehemiah was a man inspired by God, and these are recorded for us by God. And I think it's important just to note these, because I think it may suggest some things. First of all, I just want you to notice that while these actions of these individuals may go unnoticed by us, they were not unnoticed by God. Name after name, family group after family group, God acknowledges the work and their effort in His kingdom and creating His city and the walls of that city. Furthermore, I think it also suggests to us something else, is that while the responsibility of the work was given to the community, it's the individuals who are noted, who did the work, right? I mean, we have a work to do as a church, but it's noting the individuals who go out and do that work. And the final thing is, these are real people. How much different this book would read if it just said, well, Israel got together and built the wall. Or Israel got together and did this. Instead of saying, hey, this guy, the perfume maker, he worked on the gates. Or this guy, this family group. These are real people who had real struggles and real challenges and gathered together with the work. I just think it's neat looking at this, a sense of how this book is composed. Something else we need to notice. The chapters that we're kind of beginning tie all the way back to the events of chapter 7. In chapter 7, we begin reading of how after the gates were built that they looked at the city, and the city, though, was uninhabited. Look at chapter 7 and look, if you will, in verse 4. Now the city was large and spacious, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not built. And so as we kind of have that scenario, the walls were being built, but nobody really inhabited the city except for the leaders. So how are they going to take care of that problem? It's where we jump to chapter 11. And that also kind of gives us a big framework, of this book. Because the first 6 chapters of Nehemiah are all about building the wall. Chapter 7 is the dilemma that's faced after building the wall. Chapters 8 through 10 is all about spiritual revival. And then the last 3 chapters are really about organizing this new community, or reorganizing the community of God in Jerusalem. Just kind of keep note of that. There's 2 other points we're going to make before we jump in. The first of this, I don't know if you realize it because where the book of Nehemiah is located in our Old Testaments, but this is really the last bit of narrative history we've got in the Old Testament. Now, the prophets mention a few isolated instances, But as far as narrative, talking about the history of God's people, this is it, okay? Before the 400 years of silence, beginning the Gospels. So this represents the last we have read of the Old Testament people's actions. The second thing I want us to mention is just something to note. I want to bring it up. Look over in chapter 12 and verse 31. The way the story's laid out, Nehemiah switches back to the first person pronoun I in verse 31. And that, a lot of people speculate why that is the case. They say, well, some of this is from his own personal memoirs. Some of this is being told from the perspective of just an official. All kinds of different explanations, but the text does change there in their pronouns beginning in verse 31. So just saying all that just says some background information. So let's jump into the text itself. And really the first portion of the text we're going to look at is really a list for a large portion. But it really goes to address the problem that we talked about in chapter 7, is how is this city, the walls have been rebuilt, how's this city going to be inhabited? Well, what the people decide through the guidance of God, they cast lots. And as the lot is cast, 1 out of every 10 persons is chosen, and they are brought in to dwell in the city. The other 90%, they get to remain in the countryside and the city surrounding Jerusalem. But that 10% is chosen to then go and occupy their place in Jerusalem. And I want us to notice verse 2 of chapter 11. And it says, and the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. You notice what it says? Verse 2 and the connection between verse 2 and verse 1 is a little unclear. Did we have some additional volunteers, or were they really talking about the men after they were chosen by lot? They agreed to it. They were excited about it. They weren't drug off in a sense, but they accepted their charge. I don't know which one it is, but notice what the people did. They blessed them. That 10% that was chosen to go and occupy Jerusalem, it was to be a sacrifice. The decision to leave homes and families and businesses and reoccupy Jerusalem, it was meant to be a sacrifice, and the people recognized it. I mean, just think for a minute some of the ideas. I mean, when we think about it, what we're seeing here is, first of all, to go and live in Jerusalem at this time, they basically had to reorder their view of material things. They had to give up the land that they had established and began working for the past decade, and to take up some new kind of business in Jerusalem. They had to really reorder or rearrange their social priorities in the sense that they had set down roots in a community, and they were leaving those and going into the city. As much as we've been focusing on the fact that Jerusalem is being rebuilt at this time, you know what? For the last 70 years, it was largely a ghost town. And you think about a ghost town, how many amenities existed there? They were taking up the charge to be pioneers, to go into this city, to establish it again. And finally, they became the focal point of the enemy. They were the target of the enemy. We looked at all those different people throughout the book of Nehemiah, whether it's Sanballat or Tobiah or Geshem, and they were always focused on the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Those who chose to live in Jerusalem were going to be the focus of the targets of the enemy's focus. It was a sacrifice, and the people seemed to acknowledge that. They blessed the people who volunteered to go into the land or go into the city. Now, as we think about the rest of that text, before I get your comments, I just want to pull out a few things just to kind of have you look at. In verse 1 and verse 18 of chapter 11, Jerusalem is identified by this term. It is a holy city. That term doesn't pop up a lot throughout the Old Testament, a couple times in Daniel and a couple of other times in the other prophets. But here in chapter 11 of the book of Nehemiah, God's city is identified as a holy city. And I think the intention for us is maybe twofold. First of all, to recognize that what Nehemiah and Ezra and Zerubbabel and all the people were engaged in were not just a municipal action, an action of building, but they were building up the city of God. But it was also a reminder that this city was to be different than everybody else. It was to be set apart not only in its structure, but the people who inhabited it. It was to be a holy city. Some other things about this list I just kind of bring up. I think it's noteworthy to look down in verse 3, where it looked at the heads of look at verse 3. Now these are the heads of the provinces who lived in the Jerusalem. But in the cities of Judah, each lived on his own property in their cities, the Israelites, the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, and the descendants of Solomon's servants. This is not a big point, but I think it is interesting to note in verse 3. Sometimes, either in history or our own current age, there's always a separation between clergy and laity. Those who are leadership and those who are the followers. But here in this text, when they go into the land and the surrounding cities, we see the Levites, we see the priests. They're all living in amongst the people. They do not isolate themselves from the flock. Something else, I just kind of put some things out of this list. In verse 16, I think it's interesting. We think often about the Levites. They're the priests, right? And we sometimes think about the priestly observance. I mean, they're offering sacrifice. But I just want you to see in verse 16 how broad the scope of their work is. In verse 16, it specifically mentions a phrase, the outside work of the house of God. There were Levites who was custodians of the temple. The work of the Levites was much broader than we may sometimes just initially think. It went from just physical labor on the house of God down to the sacrifice and teaching God's law. It was pretty broad. And then finally, this whole list is meant for us to be seen as people who are meant to worship God, and that each role these people were going to play was vital. In verses 18 and 19, all the Levites in the holy city were 285, and also the gatekeepers of Akub, Talmon, and their brethren who kept watch were 172. So you have this number of people, and all of them were important. All of them had a vital role to play. And as I read this list, I'm going to tell you the New Testament passage that most comes to mind quickest. It's 1 Corinthians 12. I mean, you see all these different people doing all kinds of different works, but all of it was meant to function to bring about this idea of a holy city and the people who honor God and do what he wants them to do. So that's really this section. Anything stood out to you all in this text that you all would like to bring up before we kind of jump onto the rest? Larry?
Yeah. You asked the question, why did they need people to live in Jerusalem? And what we have to understand is that in ancient times, the capital city, the strength of the capital city, really, the state depended on that. The state depended upon the strength of the capital city. So if the capital city was strong, the state was strong. And we can actually see that today. I mean, while out in the state, a lot of people don't like the city of Louisville. I lived out there, I know what they think of it. But they realized, the leadership in this state realized Louisville being strong is good for Kentucky. If Louisville's strong, Kentucky can be strong. So it was even more important in ancient times.
So I don't know if you heard Larry. Larry brought up the point that it was important for the capital city to be strong. As the capital city was strong, it reflected on the strength of the state itself. And so the city needed to be inhabited with people so it could be strong and the entire region can benefit from the strength of Jerusalem. It's a good point. Anybody else in this text? I know it's a list, but anything else? Mark?
Well, the first part, you sort of talked about it. Sometimes in serving the Lord, we've got to make sacrifices. And we've got to do things for the greater good that we may not want to do, but we need to do. That's part of serving the Lord.
Yeah. So Mark points out the idea of sacrifice, the need sometimes for sacrifice. And I just think it's amazing here. This may be stretching this point just a little bit. The point of the importance of just being there. Okay? Willing to say that I'm going to be there. I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to show up. There was work for them to do, but just their willingness to accept the charge to show up and go was an important sacrifice. Boyd?
Just one minor thing. It says,
That is true, and there's a couple of points to that. So the leaders had already begun to occupy Jerusalem, some heads of the family. And then when you talk about rebuilding the wall in front of their house, the question was their house outside the wall or inside the wall is another question, because you had Jerusalem proper, and then you had kind of a suburb around it. But that's a good point. So there were people there, but it was not enough to measure or have any great standing before that. But that's a good point, boy.
And leaders have to be the ones sometimes who lead in the sacrifice.
Absolutely.
Leaders can never ask people to do something that they're not willing to do themselves.
And that's a great point, because that's one of the hallmarks of Nehemiah throughout this book, isn't it? His willingness to get his hands dirty, his willingness to leave the Persian court and come and sojourn with God's people, his willingness to take a stand if necessary, his willingness to sacrifice. So leaders leading the sheep. So all great points. So let's look really at the last part of chapter 12, so as we kind of run down through this list. And what we have in chapter 12 is really the dedication of the wall. And I'd like us to start by just reading as we begin verses 27 through 30. It says, "Now at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites from all their places to bring them to Jerusalem, so they might celebrate the dedication with gladness, with hymns of thanksgiving, and with songs to the accompaniment of cymbals, harps, and lyres. So the sons of the singers were assembled from the district around Jerusalem, and from the village of the Neophathites, and from Beth Gilgal, and from their fields in Gibeah and Asmaveth. For the singers and had built themselves villages around Jerusalem. The priests and the Levites purified themselves. They also purified the people, the gates, and the walls." We don't know how long it transpired between the building of the wall and this dedication of the wall, but it seems to be soon thereafter. And the rest of chapter 12 is to taken up with this dedication of the wall and celebration of everything that God had done for them. Now, I want you to notice, first of all, when they set out to dedicate the wall, to recognize its importance, they first purified themselves. Those who would lead in the worship and those who would participate in the worship. That's what we see. The Levites purified themselves, the people, and the wall itself. I don't know exactly how they did that, but it says they purified it. And that's what they set out to do. And the way they went out to go about their celebration, you had two great choirs that would go along the tops of the walls from opposite direction. One led by Nehemiah and one led by Ezra, and they would go along the top of the walls singing praises to God. I want you to see the last part of chapter 12 is all about thanksgiving and praise. One of the great words, I think, here in verse 31, it says, "Then I, the leader of Judah, came up on top of the wall, and I appointed two great choirs." Actually, in Hebrew, that word is thanksgiving choirs. I mean, that's their whole purpose. They weren't singing anything else but thanksgiving to God. And all of this chapter is about rejoicing and being thankful to God. I mean, singing is mentioned 8 times in this text. Thanksgiving 6, rejoicing 7. And they all wanted to recognize what God had done. If you look down in verse 43 of the text, it talks about their point there. It says, "And on that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced because God had given them great joy." God had given them that. And I think this is an attitude, a point of view, a perspective that is so vitally important. Did God lay any of the stones in the wall? No, the people did that. Did God move to Jerusalem? No, the people were moving by lot. But they recognized that any blessing, any success they had ultimately came as a gift from God. God had given them great joy. One of the Psalms, almost seems like it's a description of this very act. If you'll look over to Psalm 48. Psalm 48. And just read the last 3 verses. "Walk about Zion and go around her. Count her towers. Consider her ramparts. Go through her palaces, that you may tell it to the next generation. For such is God, our God, forever and ever. He will guide us until death." It's just like people were walking around the wall and looked at Jerusalem and said, "This is what God has done for us." He has given us great joy. Psalm 48, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I'm see what you're saying now. Okay, thank you. I was like, I can't even see what you're talking about. No wonder I didn't correct it this afternoon. So thank you. Instead of 11:31, it should be 12:31 and 12:43. One other note, and then I'll get your comments, is in this chapter, chapter 12, King David has been mentioned 5 times. And I think that's significant, at least what they're attempting to be accomplished. 5 different times in this text. And I think there's 2 different ideas. First of all, everything that Nehemiah is doing as far as setting up worship and restoring things is based upon the authority given to David or given through David. Look, if you will, back in verse 24 of chapter 12. He talks about there as prescribed by David, the man of God. Or if you will, look over in chapter 12, verse 45, in accordance with the command of David. So when Nehemiah is acting here and how he's setting about worship, it's not on his own thoughts, it's not based upon his own preferences, it's based upon commands given through David, this man of God. And the second thing is, looking at that, is just like David did for the first temple, Nehemiah is doing for the second. He's setting up the worship as God had prescribed. He is setting up things according to the order. And so I just see in this last chapter this idea, this great sense of blessing and honor. So what are your all's thoughts on this, the end of chapter 12? Anything that stood out to you guys? Yeah. Lloyd? Of the northern region? Good point. So I don't know if you heard, Boy was talking about based on the gates and the location, form basically a half circle to really focus in on their worship of the temple complex. That good, Summer? Mark?
I think it's really clear in that text in Psalm you told us about, Psalm 48. Being thankful means that we have to actively think about what we're thankful for. So really in Psalm 48, it's found within this text, that idea of going through and just seeing things. That's the reason why we have holidays like Thanksgiving. It shouldn't just be Thanksgiving, but we are people that we demand special attention to given to things in order to be grateful for them. So we used to sing a lot growing up. We still sing it sometimes. Count your many blessings. And especially for us as Christians, when I survey the wondrous cross, we're not going to be thankful if we don't slow down and notice and pay attention to the things to which we are thankful.
Amen. So Mark, just if everybody didn't hear Mark, he was just talking about the need for intentionally focusing on things to be able to truly be thankful. I mean, we can be thankful in a general sense, but just sitting down and just seeing what God has done as they walk through Jerusalem or in our own lives, everything that God has done for us. Great points. Anybody else? Okay. So as we move to the last chapter, really the events of the last chapter seem to have transpired in the absence of Nehemiah. So when we look down in verse 6 of the text of Nehemiah 13, but during all this time I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I'd gone to the king. After some time, however, I asked leave from the king. Nehemiah was basically governor over this area of Jerusalem for 12 years, really kind of running down from 445 to somewhere around 433. And then he returned to the court of the Persian king, and we don't know really how long that was. People will speculate, but we don't know how long he was absent from Jerusalem. But eventually he returns, and chapter 13, in some ways, describes what he discovered upon his return and how he dealt with the situation. So the very first thing that he has to deal with is to remind the people that no Ammonite or Moabite would be allowed in the temple of God, in the worship to God. I mean, I want us to read that because I think verses 1 through 3 are really cool. And it says, on that day, they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and there was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So when they heard the law, they excluded all the foreigners from Israel. So again, notice there, it was the reading of the law and the people hearing the law and then choosing to obey the law. Now, why they hadn't heard this before, or if it just simply was bringing up to their reminder again, they read seemingly from Deuteronomy chapter 23, where Moses prescribed that no Moabite or Ammonite should enter into the worship or assembly of God. And they acted upon once they heard what God's will was. Now, a couple of things. I mean, we've made this point a couple of different times, but I still think it's worth bearing repeating. This command is not merely based on ethnicity, okay? It's not, because the fact of the matter is there were Moabites who did enter the kingdom, like Ruth. If you read Ruth, she was a Moabite, but she had converted and became a Jew. It was primarily based on ethnicity and religious continuation. So if you converted to Judaism, you would be allowed in. And I think there's just a powerful message there. The people of Israel were part of the covenant by birth and by their obedience to the covenant. But everybody else who wanted to be part of the covenant of God had to do so by choice. They had to submit, forsake what they had known with whatever their foreign pagan gods or any of their worships were, and to be accepted as part of the covenant people. But if you did not, you were excluded from God's worship. And he strikes here, the reason for this prohibition refers back to Numbers 22. When the people were coming out of the land and the Moabites met them, and they didn't want to extend courtesy to them, but tried to hire Balaam to curse them. And then you know the story how Balaam ultimately told King Balak how to introduce women that would lead the Israelites astray and committed the sin of Baal Peor. But that's the first problem that Nehemiah really dealt with in this text, and it shows how they alleviated, listening to the word of God and acting upon it, changing their behavior, repenting. The second thing they dealt with was with the offenses of a man named Tobiah and Eliashib the priest. Eliashib, who was the priest at this time, who was the high priest at this time, was the priest. He gave Tobiah rooms in the house of God. And not only giving Tobiah rooms in the house of God, he displaced the things that had the right to be there. And notice what he had to displace. He had to displace the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils and tithes, the grain, wine, and oil prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priest. So he took Tobiah and he removed all of those items that was their intended place, and set Tobiah up an apartment. Set him up a place of luxurious recline there in the temple complex. What does it say? How does Nehemiah describe it in verse 7? Look, it says, I came to Jerusalem and I learned about the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah. I want you to understand, that speaks to Nehemiah's character, doesn't it? Because, first of all, Eliashib obviously felt it okay. And most of the other people seemed to go along with it, right? They seemed to accept that. But Nehemiah looked at this thing they were doing. He didn't say it was just poor judgment. He called it an act of evil. And look what he did, how he responded to the evil in verse 8. It was displeasing to me, so I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. You see the zeal for Nehemiah, Nehemiah's zeal. It's just like John 2, where Jesus cast out the money changers. He looked at the house of God and said, there's something here that doesn't belong here. And it's an offense to God, and he cast them out. So that's the next charge he deals with here. And then the final one, not the final one, but then this group, is the tithes. The Levites weren't getting their daily allotment. As we well know, according to Numbers, the Levites existed on tithes, and when they weren't being paid or supported or given their food, they wouldn't serve. And so it was compromising. And what I'm going to suggest is all of these first three are kind of related to one another. So first of all, remember the Ammonites and Moabites. Shouldn't be allowed in the household of God. Anybody remember what nationality Tobiah was? In Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10, Tobiah the Ammonite. And what did he displace when he got his rooms? The tithes. So all of these three things are kind of interrelated. They are all kind of trickled down from one another. Based upon their one decision, their failure to recognize God's law about the Ammonites and Moabites, they let Tobiah in. When they let Tobiah in a place that he didn't belong, they cast out the grain offerings and the tithes and everything else, and as a result of that, the Levites weren't taken care of. By one decision or one failure, look at all the things that trickled down from it. That seems to be part of chapter 13. Two others, and I'll get your comments. Then we have the dealings with the Sabbath, in really verses 15 through 22. And the Sabbath, they were seeming to dishonor it. They were doing their daily work on the Sabbath, customary daily activities on the Sabbath. And you kind of look at this list of things, and you go, well, this one seems kind of small, right, compared to not supporting the Levites or letting Tobiah in the household of God. But I want you to understand the importance of the Sabbath, at least from the perspective of the Old Testament writers. Profaning the Sabbath was something very serious. It may have been the tip of the iceberg. It was a reflection of their attitude toward God. Look over, if you will, in Amos chapter 8 real quick. Amos chapter 8 and verse 5, just one of the prophets who speak about Amos chapter 8 and verse 5. This is the attitude of the people in Amos's day. He says, when will the new moon be over, so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may open the wheat market, to make a bushel smaller and the shekel bigger, and to cheat with dishonest scales? What is the attitude? The attitude is this Sabbath is nothing but a burden to us. When can we get it over with so we can go about our business? And what Nehemiah says here is that is the very attitude in verse 18 that led to all this trouble. Look at verse 18. Did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you're adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And again, he calls it in verse 17, this evil thing that you're doing or performing. So when Nehemiah looked at this, he saw this as something serious, an offense against God, and he says, this is what led us to this trouble in the first place, failing to honor God and to respect what he has called for us. And then the final issue that he dealt with in chapter 13 is again the issue of mixed marriages. He says in verse 23, he says, in those days I also saw the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And my understanding of this text is these were not only Jews within Jerusalem, but potentially the surrounding cities. And they had intermarried with these three groups of people, the people of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And there's two indications of the text of how far this had gone and the impact that it had on the people. The first is in verse 24. As a result of their intermarrying with these people, what could the children not do? Yeah. They could only speak in the tongue of the people of Ashdod. They lost the language of God's own people. And it seems to me the impact of that is, how are they going to hear God's law spoken or read from God's law themselves? That's what the impact of these mixed marriages had resulted on their children. The second one, look how far it went. Look over, if you will, at verse 28. It said, even one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite, so I drove him away from me. So it was not only affecting their children, this is how far it had pervaded their culture, is that one of the descendants of the high priest himself was married to one of the people that God had a prohibition against. Now, I just want to mention something quickly about 28. If anybody reads Josephus cites that one of Eliashib's, or this is where the Samaritan religion may have originated. You know, this son of Eliashib. There's not a lot of historical proof for that other than Josephus. There's a lot of different Sanballats, a lot of different people. But the story goes is that Sanballat, once Tobiah and the others were cast out of the temple, Sanballat, and here in this episode, he set up for him a new temple complex on Mount Gerizim and set up a kind of a competing religious ordinance there. You'll read that a lot and throw that in there. But this idea of mixed marriages, have we not dealt with this before? Have we not dealt with this pretty often? What about Ezra 9 and 10? Did we read about it there? Well, what about Nehemiah 6? Didn't we kind of deal with it there? And what did the people declare in chapter 10? Look over at chapter 10 and verse 30. Here's what the people pledged to do in verse 30. We will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take daughters for our sons. Now again, we don't know exactly how much time has passed between chapter 10 and chapter 13, but here this has been a persistent problem with the people, and those people had made a solemn declaration to the Lord, we're not going to do this. And then Nehemiah gets back and he goes, they're doing it. And not only are they doing it, their leaders are engaged in it. This is going to be one of those persistent problems that has plagued the people since they came into the land. And Josephus tells us that it's persisted all the way through the Persian period. But you could see almost Nehemiah's exasperation, because look how he responds to this. Verse 25. So I contended with them, and I cursed them, and struck some of them, and pulled out their hair, and made them swear by God. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Why is he so strident? Well, partially because they had broken their promise to God. But secondly, look at who he quotes. Who does he say, what does he say the ramifications of this were? He cited from Solomon. What had happened to Solomon in this text? Look at verse 26. He says, did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him. And he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. And he says, here I hear that you're committing this great evil. And so what he responds to, he says, I purified them, verse 30, from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priests and the Levites, each in his task. And I arranged for the supply of wood at the appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. So let me quickly go through a couple of applications and then get your comments in the times remaining. So that ends really the work we have for Nehemiah. And I just want to offer just some quick conclusions from this text. First of all, this book begins with prayer and it ends with prayer. And the fact of the matter is so much of our study, even the study that I lead us in, was on Nehemiah and his planning and his leadership and his administrative skills and how stalwart he was. But really, any good that came out of this book was a result of God's providential care, and Nehemiah recognized it. It begins with prayer, and it ends with prayer. The second thing, what we see in these 3 chapters to some degree is the result of tolerating evil and the need to stand up to evil. I mean, here in these chapters, the only person describing these actions, at least in the text, I'm sure there were more, as evil was Nehemiah himself. At best, people seem to go along with it or turn a blind eye, but Nehemiah described 3 different times in chapter 13 those actions as evil. He didn't call them mistakes. He didn't say it was mistaken judgment or poor wisdom. These things were evil and wrong. And it didn't matter if he was alone or anything else. It was either right or not in the sight of God. And this chapter reminds us of how we're going to have lasting revival. I mean, in chapter 11 and 12, we looked at people going back into the city and them dedicating the wall and having this great sense of zeal. And then in chapter 13, we get a bunch of issues again. The only way that revival will last is this, is just keep renewing ourselves before God. It is going to be a continuing process of reminding ourselves and correcting our behavior and correcting our focus. The final point I would make here is Nehemiah, just like Ezra, ends on a downer. As Ezra, we kind of read the book of Ezra and we get up to chapters 9 and 10 and we got all those mixed marriage issues there. Nehemiah ends in much the same way. And I'll tell you, it's almost like there's a sense of uncertainty to it. What's going to happen when Nehemiah is not there? Are the people going to do this again? Yeah, they are. The very last verse in the Old Testament talks about a curse. And that curse will not be reversed until the forerunner comes and the one he speaks about. That's the one who's going to come and change hearts. One last thing about Nehemiah, and then we'll have some words about Nehemiah. And I'll just share with you this quote. I thought it was a good quote to end with. A man of strong convictions and a forceful character, whether dealing with friend or enemy, he was always forthright and direct, often indeed to the point of bluntness, of what we today probably would call tactlessness. Pervading every atom of his being was a flaming zeal for the Lord and for his work. Oh, that God might raise up even a few in our own day, for once again the walls are crumbling and the foe is attacking. And I don't say that last phrase like it's new to our age. It's in every age. We need people willing to look at the Word of God and stand on it. As Chad led us in that song, standing up for Jesus, all that is right, all that is good, and trying to bring people onward. So that's Nehemiah. Some thoughts. We got a few minutes left. So anybody thoughts on this last chapter or any thoughts on this section as a whole? You have something, Paul?
It makes you wonder, just Ezra and Nehemiah, who held deeply to these things?
My answer is no, but I do think it was a minority. And we just have their records, but I don't know the answer to that question. But nobody else was standing up like they were. Yeah. Yep. Good point. Anybody else? Okay. That's it. Thanks, everybody.